Hey guys, in today's video I would like to discuss with you a really interesting topic, and that is Einstein's interest in philosophy. And I think a lot of you are probably surprised to find out that Einstein was very interested in philosophy because sort of the image that you have in your mind, this sort of um, stereotype you have of Einstein is that he was this genius scientist. You know, he did all this crazy math. He sort of, like, you've seen pictures about him standing by a blackboard and deriving formulas and doing all this crazy mathematics stuff. So you probably perhaps thought that that's all there was to him. That was his major interest, just sort of science. But that's actually not the case. And he really was interested in philosophy. And I would like to tell you specifically which philosophers and which schools of philosophy he liked and which ones he did not like. And it's a pretty interesting story. So, when he was a teenager, Albert Einstein read Kant's trilogy. So Kant is probably the greatest German philosopher ever, Immanuel Kant. He died in 1804, and he essentially revolutionized philosophy with his three books, which are known as his critiques. And Einstein read all three when he was a teenager. So he was like 16, 17, 18 when he got into Kant, and he really studied him very deeply and systematically. So he read Critique of Pure Reason, which is Kant's greatest work, and to some extent that's where serious philosophy starts. So if you have not read Kant's Critique of Pure Reason, I'm sorry, but you're still an amateur in philosophy. Serious philosophy starts with Kant's Critique of Pure Reason. And it's a very difficult book to understand. The language is really, really challenging. It's obscure and vague. And it essentially changes the prevalent view of space and time. That's what it's essentially all about. So it says that space and time are subjective to some extent. Like, time is not something that exists out there in the world, but it's something that in a sense exists in our brain. It's not like, I know it may sound really confusing if you hear this for the first time, but essentially time is the way that our brain organizes our inner life, like our thoughts, our feelings. They're organized in time. And I will have a separate video on Immanuel Kant. So that's Kant's first critique, and Einstein read it. He also read Critique of Judgment, which talks about sort of aesthetics. Why do we find some things beautiful? Why we find some things ugly? Why some things cause us pleasure, some don't. I think it's the least interesting of Kant's critiques, but it's important in the field of aesthetics. And finally, he read Critique of Practical Reason, in which Kant lays out his moral theory with his famous categorical imperative, which states that you should only act in a way that you would approve of if others were acting that way towards you. Like, for instance, should you kill? Well, the answer is no, because, well, how would you like if somebody else killed you? So you should not kill. Should you lie? Well, no, because what if, people were lying to you all the time? I don't think you would want that. At the same time, should you be, honest? And Kant's answer is yes, you should be honest because, well, if everybody is honest to you, do you like that? Well, yes, you do. So essentially, Kant really influenced Einstein in a lot of ways, and Kant dealt with sort of these questions of space and time and morality. Um, a lot of his writings deal with that, so he was definitely very influenced by Kant, Immanuel Kant. Who else was he influenced by? When Einstein was in his early 20s, I'm sure you know that he worked as a patent clerk in Switzerland. He just had this boring office job which provided him with a lot of spare time, and in his spare time he read a lot. And one of the books he read, on his job, which I do not suggest you ever do because you might get fired, was David Hume's An Inquiry Concerning Human Understanding. And this book was made a big impact on Einstein. So Einstein really liked David Hume's philosophy. So who was David Hume? He was this Scottish philosopher, and a lot of people actually mistakenly think that he was British. Like, he was not British, he was a Scot. All right, he actually spoke with a very thick Scottish accent, and if you were to go back in time and meet him in person, like, you would barely have been able to understand him. I guarantee you. Like, instead of saying, I got me a cup of tea, he would have said something like, I got me a cup of tea. Like, that's really, really thick Scottish accent he had. And most people actually had a hard time understanding him. You know, the ones who came from southern England. So Hume was an empiricist philosopher, and he challenged a lot of sort of classical philosophical concepts, sort of these abstract metaphysical concepts such as soul, God, causality, necessity. So he questioned all of it, and he built this skeptical system, and he questioned a lot of these basic philosophical concepts, and he rejected pretty much all of them. And he was in some sense a common sense philosopher. Like, he just pretty much said that we have experience, like we sense things with our senses, with our sight, smell, whatever, and we just kind of, as a result of long cultural tradition, we just sort of, because of our customs, we give these metaphysical, superstitious interpretations to simply sequences of events which are not linked, or they're not caused. That's just what we arbitrarily explain them to be. All right. So, like, for example, his favorite example is billiards. When you play pool, you see one ball moving to the right, it hits a ball, and then the other ball flies away. Well, isn't that causality? And Hume says, no, that's not. Like, you see one ball at this point, then at this point, at this point, then it hits, it touches, this other ball, and then you see the other ball moving in a different direction. But you see, that's all you see. There is no causality in it. It's just a sequence of states, all right? And we sort of came up with this concept of causality, and that's what all metaphysical concepts are for Hume. He calls it just products of dumb custom. So it's just our cultural tradition. We just make things up to explain those states that we see in nature. So Einstein kind of liked this simplified common sense sort of explanation that Hume provided. And Hume was Einstein's favorite sort of early modern philosopher. That's definitely the case. Next, Arthur Schopenhauer. And I have a really good video on Schopenhauer. You guys should check it out if you're curious. So when Einstein, around the same time in his early 20s, he got into Schopenhauer on that patent clerk job. He read Schopenhauer, and Schopenhauer was this German idealist philosopher who was very pessimistic, and for him, he has this really complicated sort of monistic philosophical system in which there is just one thing that exists, okay, and that thing he calls will, okay, and it's a bad translation, it's a bad term he picked, because will kind of seems like it's something human, okay. I mean, humans have a will. I mean, it doesn't make sense to say that electricity has a will, or sort of wind has a will, because it just kind of becomes mythological and silly, kind of almost new age, like there is a will in everything and stuff like that. But he was talking about this kind of force, this energy which lies deep down in everything. So the world that we see, as taking place in space and time, is not the world as it is in itself. We can never know the world as it is in itself. We can only know it as an appearance, which he calls idea or representation. And he is following in Kant's footsteps. And Kant said that we can only know that which takes place in space and time, which is the world as a phenomenon. But we can not know the world as a thing in itself, sort of the world apart from space and time, because that's all we can work with, space and time. So Schopenhauer says that, well, we can't know it sort of as a thing in itself, but we can see its manifestations. And that's why we suffer so much, because that's our actual nature. That's what we are as a thing in itself. It strives. That's its essence. It's this desire. It's this longing. It's, wanting. And that's what we are. That's what all life is, and that's what the world is. It's just this blind force, okay? And it manifests itself in different ways in inorganic nature, in plants, and in animals. So Schopenhauer did influence Einstein to a large extent, and I think that's one of the reasons why Einstein was kind of, to some extent, pessimistic about academic life. Schopenhauer was not really he did not have a lot of success as a professor of philosophy. He tried to compete with Hegel, which was not a good idea, because I mean, competing with Hegel, it's hard. I mean, he was a smart man. He was kind of a celebrity, and Schopenhauer had his class at the same time as Hegel, and students came to Hegel's class, and no one came to Schopenhauer's class. And they even say that sometimes he was delivering a lecture to an empty classroom. I mean, that's pretty depressing. And he did not really think that sort of university, college, school, that's really where you can learn. I mean, learning is independent. You just have to, think for yourself and plow through, these books by yourself. And, really, Einstein, he was getting all these offers throughout his life to, for all these teaching jobs and these big universities, but he always turned them down. He, just worked in these small little college towns, he kind of wanted to stay, just close to nature. He did not, want to have a lot of students, all these kind of skyscrapers, civilization. I think this was to some extent Schopenhauer's influence on his worldview. Next, I would like to tell you a really interesting little story. Let me ask you a question. who caused the first traffic jam in New York City? And you might be surprised that Einstein did. Einstein caused the first traffic jam in New York City. So essentially, he had a public argument with a great French philosopher, Henri Bergson. So that's what I want to tell you about next. This interesting argument that they had in a university in New York, and so many people wanted to see this public argument that there was traffic congestion. So Bergson and Einstein caused the first traffic jam in New York City's history, which is a pretty interesting fact. So, so far I've talked about philosophers he liked, and now I'd like to tell you a little episode which is kind of unfortunate, I think, and that is about a philosopher he did not like. Okay, so he had an argument with this philosopher named Brookson, and by the way, he's a fantastic philosopher. I will make a separate video on his philosophy. It's really, really interesting philosophical system, and believe it or not, you know, this kind of area of cutting-edge mathematics called chaos theory, it originates in Bergson's work to a large extent through I mean, he's a philosopher of the future, Brookson. I really think that you know, we will see that he was right about a lot of things. You know, he was so ahead of his time that we're just not ready kind of for all of his concepts yet. We're just not there yet. So they had this argument, this public argument, in which Bergson challenged Einstein's theory of relativity from a philosophical point of view. But the problem is he did not really understand Einstein's relativity, and Einstein did not really understand Bergson's philosophical system. So there was this unfortunate argument between them, and essentially, you know, most people who were present at this argument concluded that Bergson lost. Okay, so I do not know if he lost, but it seems to have left a pretty bad impression on Einstein, and he, you know, did not like this kind of modern, you know, continental philosophy, modern for his day, sort of Sartre, Heidegger, Husserl. He did not like it because of his experience with Bergson. So, you know, just to give you two words about Bergson and his philosophy, he was an irrationalist philosopher, kind of like Freud and Nietzsche. He questioned a lot of these rationalist assumptions we have. And he came up with this interesting dualistic system in which the whole world is divided into two things, okay? Matter and life. So life is that which resists matter, and that's why life is creative, because matter, well, what is science? You know, science is that which describes matter. You know, like all these formulas for math, they apply to matter, but they do not apply to life. Like, I mean, you know, when you look at all these, you know, formulas, you know, in science, in chemistry, in physics, they're all abstract and, you know, they're complicated and they describe matter, but none of them really grasp life, right? And it's kind of interesting, you know, like, they don't. And so Bergson constructs this very complicated philosophy in which life opposes matter, and life is this creative impulse, and life is dynamic. And yeah, well, I don't want to get too much into Bergson's philosophy at this point. So Einstein did not like Bergson, and he did not like sort of these cutting-edge continental philosophers, all right? Next, let me ask you a question. What is can you give me a quote by Einstein? And, you're probably like, I don't know any quotes by Einstein, but I'm sure you do perhaps know this one quote. God does not play dice. All right, so why did Einstein say this? Well, he said it because he was arguing, with Niels Bohr, the founder of quantum mechanics, about determinacy. And Einstein was kind of a determinist. He thought that things have causes, and there is no such thing as free will. And Bohr thought that sort of there is, like at the level of these tiny little particles, atoms and electrons and protons, there is this indeterminacy. And Einstein said God does not play dice. And another thing that he said is, I believe in Spinoza's God. So this Spinoza philosopher was definitely a major influence on Einstein. So who was Spinoza, whom Einstein admired so much? Baruch Spinoza was a rationalist philosopher. So right now philosophy is kind of split into analytic and continental. But before Immanuel Kant, philosophy was kind of split into empiricist camp and rationalist camp. So, rationalists were John Locke, George Berkeley, and David Hume. And the rationalists were Gottfried Leibniz, René Descartes, and Baruch Spinoza. So Spinoza was a major, a very influential rationalist philosopher. He was a Dutch Jew, and he was a Sephardic Jew. So if you do not know, Jews are kind of divided into two groups. One is called Sephardic, Sephardic, Sephardic. And they are a minority, and they come from countries like Spain and Italy, so they're sort of southern Jews. And, northern Jews, the ones from kind of northern Europe, they're called Ashkenazis. And pretty much all of these famous Jews, such as Freud, Marx, Einstein, they were all Ashkenazis. But Spinoza, he was probably the greatest Sephardic Jewish intellectual who ever lived. I mean, you could argue, but he was definitely a giant in European philosophy, and he lived in the Netherlands approximately 300-400 years ago. And Spinoza wrote a book which he called Ethics, which is a pretty bad title because, ethics kind of seems to deal with, ethics, like how you should live your life, what is good, what is bad, sort of what is, a good way to live, what is a good way to act. But that's not what his book is about. It's an abstract philosophical system which makes God impersonal, all right? So in Spinoza's philosophical system, God is not personal. And that's why Einstein says, I believe in Spinoza's God, because he did not believe in the Old Testament God, which, punishes you for, messing up. It's like, oh, you sinned, I'm going to come after you. He did not believe in that type of God. He believed in sort of this spiritual entity which essentially laws of nature. That's what Spinoza's teaching is in a nutshell, that God is not personal. God is just, forces of nature. It's just this spiritual underlying mechanism which, rules the world, and there is no freedom in it. That's why God does not play dice. And Einstein really admired Spinoza as a person, because Spinoza was really, really kind of a great man to an extent. So he got in trouble with his Jewish community for questioning, this personal Old Testament God. He questioned Talmud. He questioned a lot of Jewish Orthodox teachings, and the rabbis of Amsterdam expelled him. And Spinoza wrote a lot about psychology, and he kind of spoke about things like love and sadness and grief and how you should handle it. And Einstein really liked this part of Spinoza's teaching as well. And finally, I wanted to leave the most surprising philosopher till the end, and that is Freud. And I think this is really surprising that sort of this irrationalist Freud was a major influence on Einstein. I think that's really surprising, but Einstein was very influenced in Freud's teachings. And after witnessing World War I, he wrote a letter to Freud, and he asked him a question. Well, we sort of suffer so much, this war, all this, pain and suffering and death, is there a way out? Can we somehow escape all this conflict as human species? And Freud wrote a letter to Einstein, and his pessimistic answer was no. Unfortunately, we cannot, sort of stop conflict and violence. It's just, what we are as humans. And so Einstein, I'm not sure which texts specifically he read, but he was very influenced by, very interested in Freud's, views on sexuality, on human mind, and that's Einstein as a philosopher.